Guys, so this is a response to a question on Quora, which is a pretty cool website if you've never heard of it, Quora.com. Ask pretty much anything and get generally expert advice if you request from the right people. And you can also answer questions yourselves. It's a good way to stay in touch with writing and the English language, which is something you have to do here in Japan, in my opinion. Okay, so the question is, how long does it take a foreigner to get used to Japanese culture? And generally speaking, it takes a while. There's so one of the two of the biggest things for me personally were the omote ura distinction. And so omote basically means like front or face. It has the same kind of nuance as like your public face, and then ura can mean back, or it doesn't translate very well, but it's basically the opposite of your public face. And what you see as a visitor here in Japan, generally speaking, is the omote version of people, which is a fairly carefully crafted presentation they give you. And that's why a lot of people come to Japan and think like, everyone is just so nice, like it's so polite and the service is amazing, and these things are true for real. And it's something I admire about the place. It encourages that, so that's pretty cool. It's much better experience than, you know, like going into a convenience store in Seattle or something where it was just. Anyways, so that's one thing, is that you have to understand that the omote is not who the person really is, it's very tempting to overlook that, because generally speaking, any Westerner is used to seeing who the person actually is. We don't really make there are exceptions, like maybe in a job interview or in some kind of customer service position. Naturally, you're going to put your best foot forward and do your best to appear a certain way and kind of monitor it very carefully. But outside of situations like that, we don't really do that. So that's the big one. It's just to understand that there are certain cultural tenets people maintain when they're out and about, and that is not how they really are, generally speaking. So they're also very careful about revealing their true personality, their details about who their family and stuff like that. It's very private. And that just helps to kind of keep social interface kind of smooth and well balanced. The other one, so the first big issue is omote ura, understanding that there's a very clear distinction between public and private life, like intense, unbelievable sometimes, especially in the workplace. The second one is that the Japanese generally don't place as much emphasis on the spoken word as Westerners. They're much more into focus on kind of the subtleties of social interaction. You could even say the energy of it. And so that can, for the typical Westerner who's not used to interacting in that way, it can seem strange, like you don't know what to do kind of feeling. And that's also true in the workplace. People put an amazing amount of discipline into going with the flow, and the flow will generally, almost always without exception, be from the top. So in any group, any type of group situation, and it's a very subtle, but at the same time a very, very strict rule in the culture. And so a lot of times if there are disagreements or some kind of conflict, it's very easy to think that people are just completely avoiding it or ignoring it, when really what they do is they attempt to diffuse it in, at first, very subtle ways, which is kind of like an invitation for the opposite party to just accept and move on and carry on the relationship without delving too much into whatever the problem is, if the problem behavior is fixed. So there's a big emphasis on avoiding confrontation because it tends to lead to embarrassment and loss of face or resentment, which generally leads to more problems. So if you're aware of those two, you can probably get used to the culture fairly quickly. But you have to understand that it's a pervasive thing and it never ever goes away. So if you're feeling tired or frustrated, it can be tempting to kind of fall back on your own cultural conditioning, which is not a good idea. Um, People generally give foreigners a bit of leeway. They don't really expect them to understand the Japanese way of doing things, and a lot of them are blown away if you can just have half of a conversation. But you shouldn't forget that you are in Japan, and there's no getting away from that. And that's another reason the culture is so kind of fine-tuned and sturdy in a way, is because it has been forged through very oppressive, difficult, inescapable forces. It's an island, very few natural resources. It's been populated for a very, very long time. There's a long history of civil war and violence and incredibly oppressive laws that have forged the people into basically extremely pragmatic thinkers in terms of how they deal with stuff. Because the consequences of blowing it are, well, historically they've been pretty severe, and that still lingers here. So assuming that you want to come over here and work in a Japanese company and live a 24/7, basically as much as possible Japanese life, you could probably get used to the culture pretty fast. But you'd really have to prepare yourself and really be focused on doing that. If you're just a typical backpacker English teacher, you might never get used to the culture. You might not even notice it, to be honest. You really have to be curious and pay attention to get into things here. And so you'd likely just be treated as a guest, kind of a quaint novelty that's sooner or later going to go away. It might sound harsh, but that's about the reality of it. And they do have a very accepting, gracious culture for guests, which is very telling. In my case, I came over here, it's weird when I look back. I don't really remember what I was thinking exactly, but I wasn't thinking very clearly, and I wasn't thinking very long term. So it probably took me the better part of 5 years or so before I really got a feel for what it's like to live and work in Japan. And that included, the tail end of that was 2 years at a Japanese private K through 12 school, we call them in the US, kindergarten. No, actually even younger, basically like 2 3-year-olds all the way through high school. I worked in the elementary school, and that was the perfect study in just the most traditional, conservative Japanese workspace you can imagine. And it was a very, very tough learning curve, and very harsh at times. But after I left that, I kind of had a feel for the Japanese culture at large. But that also involved me making a lot of effort to study the language and improve at it and get feedback. And I was also studying at a traditional Japanese martial arts school, which I really, really recommend. So much of Japanese culture is really founded in the traditional. Well, I should say, okay, I'm putting the cart before the horse. The practices in the dojo of a traditional martial arts school are just unbelievably deeply rooted in the traditions of Japanese culture. So if you can move about in a dojo without pissing people off, basically, it's pretty good training for life in Japan, in my opinion. And my teacher was a very old school classical martial artist, real deal, could really, really perform, no joke type of guy who'd been studying. Well, I was there during the 50th anniversary of his school, so I'd say he's probably been studying closer to 60 years now. And so that was very interesting to watch him in action, and how he dealt with people and how the people responded to him and each other. So in Japanese culture, it's very helpful to think of yourself as just a member of a group, instead of you. And I think if you can get those 3 big ones down, omote ura, nonverbal interaction, and kind of words taking a back seat to, I don't know what you would call it. Kan is what they say in Japanese, which means feeling. It can also mean kind of psychic phenomenon. And then just being a member of a group and being aware of that and being respectful and knowing your place, you can probably get used to the culture pretty quickly. How long it takes is up to you, but you can probably do it in a year at the least, if you were like just go go go, focus focus focus, you know. So yeah, cool, great question, and I hope that's helpful.